Today's big show is on the growing economy of the 1920s. First, let's talk about mass production, which is the production of large quantities of goods using machinery and often an assembly line. And this would become the norm during the 1920s. And probably the product that best symbolized this was the Model T. By using scientific management and the assembly line, Ford Motor Company could mass produce the Model T and sell them at lower prices. And this business investment led to economic growth. As displayed in this graph, you can see a pretty consistent growth up until 1930, which is the beginning of the Great Depression, of the economic growth in real GNP per capita. So it's a steady growth during the 1920s. And business expansion led to wage increases. As business made more money, the employees made more money. Also during the 1920s, you see a growth of prosperity and productivity. Also during this time, electricity in homes became more common, with 2/3 of the homes having electricity by 1930. And with this electricity being available, all kinds of products for your home using electricity would become available. This is also the time of the land of automobiles, where there's so many people having automobiles, which really wasn't the norm until the 1920s. To handle all these new cars, more than 400,000 miles of new roads were built during the 1920s. In addition to that, there'd be new structures such as billboards and drive-in restaurants and filling stations and motels, all this industry associated in and around the use of automobiles. Auto tourism became kind of a thing where people would take vacations in their cars. They became more common. This would actually have a change in family life as teenagers began spending less time with immediate family than looking to get in the car and take off and get away from their family. This may not seem like such an unusual concept for you today, but remember, before the 1920s, this was a much more common thing. This was a much less common thing to have kids not spending time with their family. And to pay for all of these things like expensive automobiles, the concept of the installment plan came around during the 1920s, where the average person could buy expensive automobiles and you pay for a little bit at a time, so much per month. In addition to that, to continue to sell cars, automobile industry led the way with this idea of planned obsolescence. This was to create new models which were designed to go out of style and could be replaced by new and up-to-date models. This is an advertisement, I believe it's 1927, it's the late 20s, for Chevrolet, and they're talking about this bigger and better and these new models, which were in essence the same car as the one they replaced, but they were advertised as such and designed to sell more cars. In addition to that, to sell more, all these new products that were made with the assembly line and mass production, advertising became a much bigger issue during the 1920s. $500 million was spent nationwide on advertising in 1914. That number would jump to $3 billion by 1929. And the advertising often targeted women, and they'd also focus on consumers' hopes and fears. I love these two ads here. The one on the left for cigarettes, you'll notice that they are targeting both women and their hopes and fears. The ad says to keep a slender figure, you need to smoke cigarettes. And obviously appealing to people's sense of how they appear and their appearance, and on the right, Kellogg's shredded crumbles was targeted as energy food. So as you see females now participating in sports, and it gives you energy and kind of a health conscious society. And this is in the 1920s. This isn't today. So obviously, many of the things we see in our culture today really have been around for a century. And again, an example of the mass advertising. And this is an ad that, though we may not sell cigarettes the same way, it's they would appeal to have an expert. 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating. I'm not sure less irritating than what, but so they use the professional, the physician to tell you why it's good to smoke these cigarettes. And also they used in mass advertising famous athletes. This again, not different than today. Of course, the biggest athlete at the time, the biggest star would be Babe Ruth. And radio really came of age during the 1920s. It was the first commercial radio station was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1920. And by 1929, there were more than 800 radio stations around the country with radios in over 10 million homes. It became a kind of a common feature for people to have radios in just one decade. But it's important to note during this time that not everyone shared in the prosperity of the 1920s. American farmers did not share in it. On average, they earned less than 1/3 of the income of any other American worker. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, they had borrowed heavily to expand production during World War I. Remember, the government encouraged them to expand production, and there was a lot of profit to be made by expanding production. But the problem is, the war didn't last very long for farmers. By the end of 1918, the 1919 growing season, the war is over, and almost immediately, European food production increased and prices and demand for American products dropped. And on top of that, the Ford-Macomber Act in 1922 raised tariffs dramatically. And foreign countries reacted by buying even fewer American agricultural products. But let me explain this just a little bit. So a tariff is a tax on imports. It makes foreign countries' stuff more expensive for us to buy. So we want to buy less of it. Well, when you raise the price on other countries' stuff, they react by raising the price and buying less of your stuff. But the stuff that we mostly sell to other countries is agricultural stuff. Especially, this was a time where they would buy much less in the way of agricultural stuff from the United States. And so high tariffs tend to hurt farmers because they're less able to sell their stuff, their products to other countries. And the demand goes down and the price they can get drops. This is an example of, even though the nation the 1920s for the United States was a time of kind of a big economic growth, it wasn't that way for all segments of society, and in particular farmers. And that's your big show for today.